All right. My name is John Mancini. I'm president of AIIM, which is the Association for Information and Image Management. We are the Content Management Association. I will also say that we are somewhat the shoemaker's children when it comes to the adoption of content management technologies, because I run a little 45-person nonprofit business. So I have a lot of the same problems that you all have when it comes to thinking about content management and sort of the complexity of some of the solutions that have been characteristic of the space in the past. I use this as my title slide, mainly because after having been in the content management space for 15 plus years now, what I usually find is that people get enamored with the term content management or ECM, and they forget why the hell they were doing it in the first place. And so I think one of the things that's refreshing here, listening to some of the stories along the way, is that I think there's a certain clarity here that exists that's important in terms of understanding what Box is, what Box isn't, how you use it, how it relates to your business processes, and I think there's some really interesting things to talk about. I did want to make available to people, we do a whole lot of industry studies. I'll make available one of them for free to all you guys. All you need to do is text the word, I'll put this up at the end, box.net, and your email address to number 22333. Just text that to me, and I'll send you the industry study that we just did on social business. Now I thought to get started, there's 4 things that you need to know about AIM, so that you know like where I'm coming from. As I said, we're a nonprofit organization representing both the end users and the solution providers in this space. There's 4 things that underwrite what we do that I think are important to thinking about this set of issues that you guys are talking about at this conference. The first is that this question of information management, I'm convinced, is going to be a key competitive differentiator for organizations moving forward. That wasn't always the case. It used to be, you know, how well you made widgets, or how well you did this, or how well you did that. Information management, no matter what business you're in, is going to become increasingly important in differentiating your business. The second thing is that I think the people that understand that within organizations, who are many of you all, who aren't necessarily traditional IT people, are going to have a leg up, I think, in helping our organizations being effective moving forward. The third thing that underlies what we do that'll be reflected in what I talk about is that we believe that the collective experience of communities of people using these technologies has a lot more value than, for example, people like me, frankly, pontificating on content management. So I think one of the richness, one of the things that really is valuable about a company like Box is the great scope of the community that uses the tool, because it's in that community, ultimately, that you're going to find a whole lot more value than dealing with particular experts along the way. And then lastly, we are not shy that we think that an industry is comprised of both users and suppliers and all the people in the middle in a channel. And so that underlies what we do as an organization. So what I wanted to talk about, we've had a lot of conversations about this. Jeff Moore, when he spoke this morning, talked about systems of record and systems of engagement. And actually that work was done in an AIM task force that developed that whole framework of looking at the world. And I want to probe that a little bit more deeply, mainly from the perspective of, I think, helping you think about how you communicate the value of a tool like Box back into the traditional mindset that you're going to be dealing with in your organizations. Because no matter how cool you think you are, ultimately there is a system of record back in the organization that you are dealing with that you have to connect with and you have to have some conversation with. You can get away only for so long with being a rogue content management solution before you have to be part of a content management solution within organizations. And so that's the thing that I want to talk a little bit about in terms of just offering some suggestions based on an awful lot of end users that I talk to from an awful lot of companies, large and small, as they deal with some of the questions that are out there, and use some of Jeff's thought as a framework to talk about that. So the first thing that I wanted to touch on, this is what I call my history of enterprise IT in one slide. And what this is all about is basically going through a series of eras, as you can see on the slide, looking through what it is that we typically managed during each of those eras, look through the best known company, perhaps along the way, and then think about what content management was all about in that phase. Now, as Jeff said, what this has all been about, up until the last 2 or 3 years, has been about helping our organizations establish systems of record to essentially replace what we used to do in the paper world and in the paper ledger world with digital systems. And so there's a certain continuity as we've gone through those different stages in the evolution of enterprise IT. But we're in a very discontinuous place right now. This is a slide that John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins uses that I really love. He talks about the revolution that's represented by social, local, and mobile technology. And all of that is manifest in what's going on in the cloud right now in terms of solutions. And so when you think about this, again, there's an awful lot of people back in your organizations. This may be second nature to you all. There's an awful lot of people in your organizations, and particularly back in traditional IT departments, that aren't necessarily going to get this. And so that's the framework, I think, that you have to sell into in your organizations. So when you think about what's happening now, you think about the era of social and the era of the cloud, I think that raises a couple of questions. As Jeff said this morning, I think it raises a different way of looking at the world that's centered on systems of engagement. Engagement with customers, engagement with employees, engagement with partners. That's very, very different from that old world of just keeping track of who did what to whom in what time frame and documenting that, which is what systems of record were all about. But I think there's a couple things to think about as you think through this. The first one is that there is a temptation to think in very, very superficial terms about systems of record. When I look at organizations right now, back that up. Very superficial terms about systems of engagement. Because what I see right now is people setting up Facebook home pages and they tweet and they have a blog and all that stuff, but they haven't thought about how those front-facing customer systems interface back into the information repositories and the customer records that actually add richness and value to the customer experience. Second thing I think we have to think about is that clearly the kind of artifacts that we're creating in social systems and systems of engagement are not traditional records in the traditional record sense of the term. It's not like a contract or something or an insurance policy that you're going to have to save for like 100 years until somebody dies. It's not that. It's much more ephemeral, but you have to have a framework around that in some way, shape, or form to manage it. You have to manage it in some way. You just can't let that stuff hang out. And so I think we've got to think about how systems of engagement connect to systems of record first. And I think secondly, we have to think about what we have to unlearn from the world of systems of record as we move into this world of systems of engagement. Because that hardcore records management, every piece of content needs to be treated as if it's a diamond, isn't going to hack it, given the volume of information that we're dealing with moving forward. So when you switch this forward and think a little bit about what your typical CIO is wrestling with in your organization right now, what's the implications of that whole world? There's a couple things to think about, I think. The first one is that the person who's the CIO in your organization has a very different mandate now than they did 5 years ago. The CEO is demanding much different things. You can look at every business survey that's been done out there, and it is clear that the expectations are very, very different now than they were as recently as 5 years ago. 5 years ago, all anybody cared about was risk mitigation and cost reduction. Those were the two things that really governed how we judged a CIO, how we judged our enterprise IT systems. And what's going on now is there's a whole different axis out there that focuses on value, that focuses on engagement, that focuses on collaboration, that focuses on connection and connecting people with each other. That's a way different kind of CIO mandate. And you've got to help that person meet his or her goals with regards to this, because lots of those people have been in their jobs a long time, and they don't necessarily understand how this new world of cloud and this new world of social helps connect them to that business objective that they have. Second thing you have to deal with is rising expectations. Jeff touched on this earlier this morning. And I think there's two aspects of rising expectations. The first is the obvious one of the end user. You know, odds are, when I went to a job 10 years ago, the coolest piece of technology that I got was the laptop that my employer handed me and the cell phone that they handed me. And that has obviously been thrown completely out the window. And so those expectations in terms of ubiquitous access anywhere on any device in any platform, that's an undercurrent that we all have to deal with as managers. The CIO has to think through a strategy for. But he also has another set of expectations that are rising, which is that's from the business. Because knuckleheads like me come into my IT people every single week and say, why the hell can't we do this? And this solution set that's represented by Box, I think is an important part of helping that person answer that question. Because it's the kind of thing that doesn't require the kind of ramp up and long cycles and all that stuff that just scares the CEO to death right now. I think the third thing that you can help them deal with is this question of rising complexity. Content complexity is getting so incredibly difficult from both a volume perspective and a type perspective. You've all seen those data points from the EMC IDC study that says that the quantity of information that we're going to manage in the digital environment is increasing by 44x over the course of the next decade. All that stuff lands squarely at the feet of the CIO, and the CIO's got to think of some way to manage around that whole question. And thinking about how solutions like Box fit into at least a portion of that equation, I think, are very important moving forward. Fourth is this question of compounding. I don't know that we have an answer for this yet. Is that, as I say, the quantity of digital information is increasing by 44x. Storage costs are declining. I don't think that we'll be able to stay ahead of the information growth curve faster than we're going to be able to stay ahead of the storage cost decline curve. So at some point, there's going to be increasing costs. And we've already seen this in big organizations. And I would urge, if you're a big organization, help them think about how a solution like Box helps them address the problem that big organization CIOs are finding that all of their new innovation initiatives are being crowded out by legacy IT storage investments to cover this increasing amount of information that they have to manage. And if you can somehow give them an answer to that question, you'll be a hero in their eyes, because I'm seeing it all over the place with end users that say, gosh, we ought to be spending 50% of our IT budget on new innovations, maybe 20% if I'm a very aggressive company, versus legacy implementations. And all that new investment is being crowded out by storage costs right now. So I think an important thing to help them with. Another aspect is that I think we've spent, in the world of systems of record, we spend all our time on the IT equation focusing on the T part. Jeff talked a little bit about this. I think we're in an environment right now where the important part is starting to be the I part. It is the information associated with IT, not just the technology. I can't remember which speaker it was this morning, but they talked about helping IT staffs hop up a ledge in terms of the value proposition in their organizations. Clearly, cloud-based solutions are a very critical part of this. In my organization, we're working now on a certification that focuses for information professionals on the information side of the equation rather than the technology stack side of the organization. This risk-reward balancing act, when it comes to the management risk associated with unmanaged information, is changing. And it's continually a balancing act. In the last decade, the pendulum swung way, way over onto the compliance side. You know, way, way over as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley and Enron and Federal Rules of Civil Procedure and all that stuff, where the emphasis was on nailing and controlling everything. Those concerns are still there, but the pendulum is a lot more on the business side right now. And so take advantage of that. Think about how you may help people square that circle, preserve some modicum of process on the risk side, but simultaneously give them tools on the business side. And then lastly, I think in terms of implications, I've been doing IT stuff for 20, 25 years. I have never seen a time when the titans are at greater battle with each other than right now. You know, whether it's Google versus Apple versus Microsoft versus HP, but you can go down the whole list, you know, one after the other after the other. And I don't know what the solution is, but this tends to take on the fervor of a religious battle within organizations. And you need to help the CIO kind of deal with that within the organization, because this isn't going away. And those pressures, the speakers this morning that talked about that whole pressure on the enterprise IT traditional space are going to continue to grow. It's not going away. As Jeff said, you know, Oracle is going to be around till the cows come home, but there is going to be pressure in that space over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. So the last thing I think that I just wanted to leave with you in terms of, you know, why you should care about all this, in terms of this whole question of systems of record and systems of engagement and understanding the mind frame that is associated with systems of record, how different it is from the world that you're probably used to on the cloud relative to systems of engagement, and helping you figure out ways within your organization to square that circle. There's just two things I wanted to leave you with. The first was from some of the work that we did with Jeff last year, which is that when you think about all the different kinds of considerations that are on the left-hand side of this slide, you know, things like standards and content types and, you know, how search is treated and usability and things like that, and think about how we viewed that in the world of systems of record. Think about how 90% of your IT staffs view those sets of considerations. And then think about how different that is in the cloud and social world. Somewhere, organizations have to figure out how to connect the dots here. Because we are not going to exist in a world that is purely driven by the systems of engagement side. It's got to be tied back in some way, shape, or form to the world of systems of record. The second thing I think that's really important is to, in your organization, is to understand where you are in my little Mancini's hierarchy of information needs. Because the miracle that Box was able to figure out was that essentially everybody was assuming that SharePoint was the answer to the bottom two pieces of this pyramid. And what they accomplished over the last 2 or 3 years was basically, for people that cared about file shares and that people cared about document-centric collaboration in the context of teams, they basically offered a very, very robust and attractive solution that was much simpler than what was characteristic of SharePoint. Now their challenge as a company, I think, and they started to move down this path, is how do I move up this pyramid? You know, because that's the key to really penetrating the enterprise. And I think as you penetrate the enterprise, you have to understand where Box plays, where transactional content management plays, where traditional records management plays, and how those solutions need to fit together within an organization in order to deliver the kind of a solution that pushes you to the top of this pyramid. All right, I'm on time. Any questions? Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks. Yes, Shad.
Well, I think it creates a tremendous amount of opportunity.
Awesome opportunity, I think.
For folks that figure out how to help organizations navigate that last slide, that pyramid.
Yeah, I think the question on that last slide is that the thing I always find people making real bad mistakes with is that as an organization they don't understand where they are here, and so a solution that if you are at a very, very robust maturity level in terms of how you manage content and processes, that might be appropriate to one organization. But if you're fairly rudimentary in terms of how you treat information in the context of process, if you're just kind of getting started on this, then you sure don't want $1 million solution to, right off the bat to hop in there. You've got to walk before you can run on this whole thing. And so I think that's important. And as I say, you know, I constantly hear people say, well, first I heard people say, well, didn't SharePoint mean the death knell of ECM systems? And then I hear, well, doesn't Box mean the death knell of SharePoint? And I would say no to all of the above, you know, because what Box does is different than what SharePoint does. What SharePoint does is different than what transactional content management systems do. What transactional content management systems do is different than what hardcore records management systems in very litigious industries do. And so there's a role for all of those things, and I think the really interesting role within organizations is the architect that's going to help people think through what does what in what environments and how they connect together. Which then I think also implies that how open your system is to integration, which is again I think one of the things that Aaron has really gotten right, is that that becomes a really important competitive differentiator, I think, moving forward. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll give you an easy one, John. Do you think there is a way for cloud services and legacy applications to coexist? Like, does it have to be, opposite sides of a war, or is there some common ground?
I think unless you're in a startup environment where you have the luxury of choosing just from the start what you're going to use, they have to coexist because nobody's going to rip out. If I run a 45-person organization, and I'm not about to rip out my legacy systems in order to tap into the advantage of the cloud. Well, geez, if I'm not willing to do it as a 45-person organization, then what the hell is a 50,000 or 75,000 or 100,000 person organization going to do? They're not going to rip it out. They got to coexist, which then again I think puts that real strategic importance on the openness and the ease of integration between those. And that's going to be the differentiator, I think. Over time, legacy stuff is going to shift to cloud-based stuff, but it's not going to happen overnight.
So what happens to all the sayings?
Pardon me?
So what happens to everyone's saying?
It's a good question. We all spent a lot of money on that stuff, didn't we?
So would you suggest that where people are dealing with entrenched systems, right, and possibly some religious fervor to go with it, that they ought to focus with cloud implementations on things that are new, that are relatively untouched by legacy systems?
I think that's I would look at it either that way or from the point of view in which the use case is so compelling that it's like a duh. I think in many organizations, it was that question of dealing with external audiences outside the firewall for relatively large files that set the groundwork for this whole new class of content management product, essentially, that now that they establish a beachhead there and people see how that works, then they start to think, okay, well, how do I want to bring that back across the firewall into an enterprise framework, which is, I think, where Box is trying to go over the course of the next couple of years or so.
John, just like there's legacy systems, there's also legacy content on paper, faxes, voicemails, email. And I haven't heard anything today how the Box strategy is going to manage that existing content. Don't you think that's important as well? Because everything I've heard today, it's all electronic information born in a spreadsheet, a Word document, Excel, PDF file, but that's all new information. How about the old legacy stuff?
Yeah, I don't think the problem that say a Box has is any different than the problem that any existing content management solution has, which is that that backfile conversion can just kill you if you spend too much time trying to do that. You'll never get to the day forward value proposition that you're talking about. The other longer term question is that nobody is really dealing with is that essentially right now in most of these solutions is a retention period of infinity. Now, if individual on-premises solutions are going to have a problem thinking about how you manage that without an effective disposition policy for assets once they get beyond their useful life, then certainly people that are aggregators of all that operate in the cloud, are ultimately going to have that equation. Will they allow you to essentially save everything for always at a price point that's feasible? And I would hazard a guess that the answer will be no, which then gets you again back into that old, crotchety feeling world of, You know, what do I retain? What do I get rid of? How do I make judgments about retention schedules? You know, all that stuff that, you know, lots of people on the systems of engagement side like to say, oh, that's what all those old farty people on the systems of record side care about. But eventually that's going to all come back. Were you giving me the cutoff sign back there? Any other questions? I'm around. I'm John. I didn't put that up here. John Mancini, AIM.org. Feel free on the blog, or if you want to get the industry study, or hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn. Be happy to connect up with everybody. So thank you all very much for coming to the session. Appreciate it.